It's been interesting being in preparation for this program and thinking about the characteristics of really board-savvy CEOs. I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of association CEOs over my tenure at the organization, and I have to admit that I believe one of the key elements of a board-savvy CEO is really understanding the value that the board and the task forces bring to the organization. So it's a great part, it's an element of respect and really respecting the system and respecting the people within the system and what they bring to the organization. That may seem really basic, but I think there are people who discount it and almost feel as if that governance is a burden, and I think it just shows in the way they approach things. So for me, one of the key elements of a really board-savvy CEO is the whole respect for the system and the players in it. And then the other thing that I think I've seen over the years is an element of what I might call preparation, of really looking at how you can take the time to make the system better. I have to admit, sometimes I get caught on this. I just had a board meeting last Wednesday, and what we were able to do is go back and do a PowerPoint presentation for all of our 16 board members on our policy, governance model that we use. Now, this is something that I've done in orientations over the past number of years, but having everyone in the room at the same time looking at it and being able to discuss it just gave it a whole different element. So going back to my thought, preparation, it means giving real thought to what you need from that entity that is part of the governance. So, for example, with the board, what do you really need from this board meeting? How are you going to craft the agenda so that everyone understands what is the scope of work for that meeting? And then making sure that they have the material they need to make a decision. And that means there's a lot of work that goes into that preparation. So it's getting the right information and the stuff that they don't need to see out of the whole mix. Part of that preparation to me is one of my rules of thumb, and that's no surprises. There should be nothing that sort of just pops up of, oh, and now I need, or and by the way. So some of that comes down to data. It comes down to making sure that people are informed. I have to admit, we get our board books out 10 days in advance, and that works out really well because then people have enough time to review them. And if they don't have all the materials that they need, then it gives me enough time, and my team enough time, to get together the information that they might need. I think back to when Doug Eadie was here in Michigan not too long ago and did a presentation for our CEOs. And he talked about the importance of spending time on governance. And I think his rule of thumb was spending at least 20%. I have the CAE content outline here in front of me, and lo and behold, in the CAE content outline domain 5, governance and structure, it reports that the average association CEO spends 9 to 11% of their time. So if we take these two numbers, it means that all of us should be spending more time on the whole governance element and taking the preparation that needs to go into looking at governance documents, making sure that we're maintaining an effective system, and that we're really doing what the board needs from staff to do the work that they have at hand. So those are some of the characteristics I'm thinking of, Jim. Do you have anything additionally?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great segue about the communication aspect. I remember one of my very first presidents when I took over as the executive director at ANC, 8 years ago now, told me that, you know, if anything during your year, please, I don't want surprises. I don't think any board wants to be surprised by information. And so I think, you know, developing a very consistent communication plan while you think a communication plan is important for your organization, I think a key characteristic of a savvy CEO is that they develop a communication plan on how they disseminate information to their board, whether it's updating just important information going on with the board, dates, things like that, or where we're at with the implementation of the strategic plan, to financial reporting information. Making sure that you keep those open lines of communication with your board, your executive committee, your president on where the organization is at, so that again nobody's surprised where we're at. On that second note, to follow that, in terms of other kind of helpful, I think, characteristics of a savvy board, or CEO rather, is that they understand their role as the CEO and realize that this is not your board of directors. In other words, this is not your organization. You are serving at the request of the board of directors. It is not your organization. While you're obviously a key component in its success, that you realize that it is truly the board that owns this organization. And I remember back when I was in scouting, the rules in scouting were to leave the place better than where you found it. And I think that's the role of the CEO, is that they're merely there to help the organization succeed and make sure it stays there long after you're gone. Because it's those members who own that organization and have to make sure that you work with them to see it happen. And the last thing I'll just mention, I think, kind of goes back to the communication piece, is just a CEO that's very transparent in what's going on in the organization. There's nothing to hide. There's no hidden information. Everything is open to the board members. There's that open line of communications about everything that's possibly available to present to the board. Do that. I've even had some board CEOs association CEOs who say, sometimes they feel like they over-communicate to the board about information because they want to make sure that whatever they're doing is above the board or above board, and that they're just presenting all the information they can to their board. When you think about board development, I think one of the first things that an organization has to start with, and that's before you even get to the boardroom, and that's the nomination process. I think one of the things that I see solid organizations doing in developing good operating governing boards is making sure they have the right people in the right seats, making sure that when you go through the nominations process, that it's not just the nominating committee sitting around the room and handpicking who's going to be on the board, or trying to figure out at that meeting who's going to be on the board, but having a very strategic process about getting the right people on the board. We have seen several associations in A&C, for example, who have developed really good interview processes, so that when somebody's nominated to the board, they have a very intentional process of going through and interviewing them and finding out, what kind of why they decided to be on the board, making sure those people can think strategically about the organization, making sure they have a pretty well-rounded understanding of the importance of being on the board. And so I think, that's one of the first key steps, is making sure you have the right people in the right seat who understand what they're, why they're being nominated for the board, why they want to be on the board, and what they hope to accomplish while they're on the board, as in terms of the organization itself as a whole. And the second and final thing that I'll mention is, once that person does become a board member, is going through a very solid orientation process and helping them truly understand what it means to serve on the board. It's amazing how many times you talk to CEOs in some of the organizations, and their board members can't even, I'm not saying by verbatim necessarily, but they can't even recite to some degree what their mission statement is. I think a board member has to be trained and educated on that. And I'll quote from Doug mentioning at one point in time that, one of the reasons why sometimes boards get into micromanagement issues is because they're bored. They don't have anything else to do. And Type A people typically serve on boards, so making sure they understand their roles and their responsibilities, so that when they come to the table, they're ready to work and work in a way that's effective for the organization.
I agree with you, Jim. Training is a key element, and oftentimes I believe we feel anyone who's been on a board before must know how to do it. Well, we train people on all sorts of things, and board development seems to be one of those things that we have just as a nation not done that much on. I agree with you, starting off with that whole selection piece and then the orientation to the organization. But then training on what the role of a board member is all about is key. Everyone is coming from their own work environment, and so they're usually thinking along that line of thumb, and really to get them into understanding the care of loyalty and being there for the organization. And the other thing I might add is just that coaching element. Sometimes there's someone on the board who believes that they know what they know and what they know is correct, and sometimes they need some additional perspectives. And so I try and make sure that we can get our chairman of the board so up to speed that the chairman can call and do some individual coaching with some of the board members on sometimes it's not the content, it's just the approach on how they're presenting those ideas that could just use some refinement. So I agree with you. Selection, orientation, training, and coaching sounds like it's our primary list. I appreciate all that you said about selection. And, Jim, I think that we should talk about the step even before selection. There has been a lot coming out of the ASAE literature in the past 2 to 3 years about board composition. And I think this is really healthy for organizations to take a step back and really look at how they are evaluating not only who's there, but who those people should be and who they should represent and what that size should be. I don't think there's any magical size. You know, your board should not be 3 or 6 or 12, although I think it should be manageable. And it should be a size that gets the right kind of thought processes in for the organization so that they can be moving forward in the way that they should be, so that they're really representing their members. And I think this has really been healthy discussion that many organizations have had, even with their components. So if there's a local, a state, a national or international entity, I think they're all starting to look at collectively how all these boards work together, how they work with components. So if there is a group that represents different segments of members, but they all share the members, that they're starting to work together, and looking at how those boards can work together has really been healthy. The other trend is this whole idea of moving nominating committees more to the leadership identification and training, which means that we're really starting to look at bringing people into the pipeline based on their leadership capacity, or we're building that leadership capacity before they get into the board. So I think all of the things that have come out of the literature recently about composition, where they're coming from, diversity of thought, all of those things are really, really healthy. Any ideas you have along that line?
Well, I agree with you completely. I mean, I think that's been the kind of the fun about the past, I think, few years now with and being involved with ASAE and some of the knowledge coming out, and whether you feel like you need to decrease the size of your board down to 5 people, or whether you're content with the 16 or 22 people you have on your current board. The fact is, I love that we're having these conversations about making sure that whatever number that happens to be, is that we think about, who those people are that are filling those roles. I think about the aspect of, making sure that, so many times people feel like, because you have represented a certain industry that, all those industries are the only people that can be represented on that board. I love the thought of, and I think, Cheryl, you kind of alluded to that in that conversation of, if you're, for example, if you're a nursing association and you're thinking about opening up there's a new school that might be opening up at one of the local universities, and what would be the problem of having, the dean of nursing on your board? I mean, being able to think outside the box and not always having to have your members necessarily on the board, but those organizations or interest groups that impact your organization, and letting them have a seat at the table. And I love the idea of, letting the nomination process be viewed as really a leadership process. It's the right people on committees. It's getting those right people in committee chair roles, helping them understand the whole organization and what we're all supposed to accomplish here, so that way when the time comes for them to serve on the board, it's not their first time understanding, how all these pieces fit together. So having a good committee chair orientation process where they understand where their role fits into the greater scope of the organization. So that way when they do get a seat at the board table, that's not their first time experiencing and understanding, the organization as a whole structure. And I think continually remembering to bringing those groups to the table that don't already have a seat that you want to try to influence. I find it so fascinating when you see an organization of, and I'll pick on this certain segment here, but, you see a group of 50, 60-year-old white men sitting around a board table trying to figure out, well, how can we get more young people involved in our organization? And it's as simple as sometimes letting that young person maybe have a seat at the table, not just as an ex officio person that's just to sit in the room and say nothing, but an actual active working board member who's a part of moving the entire organization forward too. So, I think I'm loving this conversation around the board composition and how we do that, and also how we educate these folks on their roles as the organization, so we all work together to move it forward.